Maurice Wilson was a British man who became famous for his daring, ill-fated attempt to summit Mount Everest in 1933. Born on April 21, 1892, in York, England, Wilson was the son of a middle-class textile mill owner. Although he had aspirations to join the family business, the outbreak of World War I at the age of 16 altered his path. Following his older brother's footsteps, Wilson enlisted in the British Army at 18 and was eager to prove himself on the front lines. In November 1917, he was sent to France to fight in the war. During the battle, Wilson showed remarkable bravery. His battalion was surrounded by German forces, but Wilson, in charge of machine gun post, kept firing to repel the enemy. His persistence was a factor in his survival, as he was the only soldier in his company who wasn't injured. For his heroism, Wilson was awarded the Military Cross. However, just a few months later, in July 1918, Wilson was shot in the back and left arm, which would cause him lasting pain and weakness in his arm for the rest of his life. After being hospitalized for several months, Wilson contracted the flu, which kept him in bed until the end of the war. Wilson's injuries and the subsequent rejection of his request for a pension by the War Ministry left him bitter and resentful. This rejection fueled his anger toward the British government, a feeling that stayed with him for the rest of his life. After the war, Wilson struggled to find purpose. He wandered the world, changing jobs and marrying twice, but still felt a deep sense of dissatisfaction. By 1932, his health was deteriorating, and he was in search of a way to find peace. During this time, Wilson met a guru who taught him the benefits of fasting and prayer. Wilson decided to fast for several weeks and found that it alleviated his depression and physical ailments, strengthening his belief that fasting and prayer could solve any problem. Motivated by this newfound spiritual resolve, Wilson embarked on a mission to prove the power of fasting to the world. While reading about the 1924 British Mount Everest expedition, which saw climbers George Mallory and Andrew Irvine disappear during their attempt to reach the summit, Wilson became fixated on Everest. He vowed to reach the summit of the world's highest peak, but his plan was unorthodox. He intended to do it alone, using only fasting and prayer. To achieve this, Wilson came up with a bold plan. In 1932, a British expedition was scheduled to fly over Everest to photograph the peak, and Wilson thought he could join this expedition. Once over Everest, he would parachute out and be the first to summit the mountain. However, he soon abandoned this plan in favor of an even riskier one. He would crash-land his plane at 15,000 feet on Everest, covering half the distance by air and the rest by fasting and prayer. Wilson had no experience with mountain climbing or aviation, but he was determined. He bought a Gypsy Moth, a small open cockpit biplane used in flying circuses, and painted it with the name Everest, a name he created. Despite his lack of training, he began flying lessons, though his instructor warned him he would never make it even to India. Undeterred, Wilson's plan attracted the attention of the British Air Ministry, which opposed his reckless actions. The ministry informed the Nepalese authorities about Wilson's intentions, and his permit to enter Nepal was revoked. Despite the setback, Wilson was undeterred. He publicly tore up the telegram from the British Air Ministry, defying their orders, and set off without permission. His journey took him across Europe and into North Africa, where he encountered several obstacles. In Tunisia, he was briefly arrested but quickly released. He also accidentally refueled his plane with contaminated fuel, but managed to make a safe landing in Gabes, Tunisia. After resuming his flight, Wilson faced another challenge in Cairo, where he learned that the permit to fly over Iran he had been assured of was nowhere to be found. Instead of waiting for the bureaucracy to resolve, he chose to fly directly to Baghdad, avoiding Iran and continuing his journey east. Wilson's persistence continued to lead him into trouble, especially with British officials who were determined to stop him. Upon reaching Bahrain, he was confronted by a British officer who warned him of the risks ahead, particularly the lack of landing spots in Iran and the likelihood of his arrest upon arrival. Despite the officer's warnings, Wilson refueled his plane in Bahrain and flew directly toward India, evading Iranian airspace. After a few more stops, including one in the Persian Gulf, he managed to land in Gwadar, a part of British India. His fuel was nearly exhausted, but he had made it. Wilson continued through India, where he received media attention. Despite the mounting pressure from British officials, who were aware of his illegal flight, he reached the town of Purnia, near the Nepalese border, where local police confiscated his plane and arrested him for flying without proper permits. Faced with arrests and financial difficulties, Wilson was forced to sell his plane in July 1933, abandoning his dream of crashing into Everest. Despite this setback, Wilson remained determined. He spent the winter of 1933 in Darjeeling, India, fasting and praying in hopes of still finding a way to climb Mount Everest. His efforts were not in vain, as in March 1934, he disguised himself as a Buddhist monk and crossed into Tibet. He continued his journey on foot, despite his lack of climbing experience. He eventually reached Camp 3 on Everest in just 3 days, with 2 companions, but they refused to continue further. Wilson, however, ignored their pleas and pressed on alone. Wilson's stubbornness ultimately led to his death. He instructed his companions to assume he was dead if he did not return within 2 weeks. After waiting for a month, his companions descended back to base camp. In late July, they reported his disappearance, and 1 year later, in 1935, the Eric Shipton Everest expedition found his body between Mount Everest and the Chang's Peak. He had died on the mountain, his body accompanied by his diary, backpack, and torn tent. The last entry in his diary, dated March 31st, 1934, simply said, "Heading out again." Morris Wilson's story is one of unrelenting determination, stubbornness, and tragic consequences. Despite his lack of experience, his unwavering belief in fasting and prayer drove him to undertake an audacious mission that ultimately cost him his life.